Welcome to all of our panelists, to all of you here in the room and online. I'm going to turn it back to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So before we begin with each panelist's remarks, I want to do a couple of quick things. First, I have to do a bit of obligatory housekeeping, so please forgive me. For those of you in the room, please be aware that this panel is being live streamed, and it will also be recorded and co-streamed by Wisconsin Eye. This lecture was approved for 1 Wisconsin CLE credit by the Board of Bar Examiners. For those of you here in person, please be sure to sign the CLE sheet in the back of the room. For those of you attending virtually, please listen for the passcode that I will give around 4:50 p.m. And at the conclusion of the panel, there will be a Google form in the chat box on Zoom, and you should please complete that form by 8 p.m. Central Time today. In addition, we plan to save time at the end for audience Q&A. If you're here in the room, there are index cards for you to fill out, and folks will come around and grab those from you. For virtual attendees, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions, not the chat, but the Q&A. So much for the housekeeping. I also wanted to provide a little bit of context for why direct democracy, why now? Direct democracy has been in the news quite a bit lately. You've probably all seen that abortion was on the ballot in Kansas this summer, and it will be on the ballot again this fall in several states, both to establish a right and in some states to limit it. You may have seen that a number of states have used ballot initiatives in the past few years to change the way their state handles the drawing of electoral district lines, shifting that power to independent commissions in an effort to mitigate gerrymandering. And you may have seen earlier fights over ballot initiatives for decades, over things like the imposition or limitations of taxes, efforts to abolish or retain the death penalty, to establish or to limit a minimum wage, to expand Medicaid, or otherwise to affect healthcare. There are 26 states that allow some form of voter-proposed lawmaking, either to enact statutes, to reject statutes a legislature has adopted, or to amend the state constitution. Wisconsin is not among these. There are also 19 states, including Wisconsin, that give voters the power to recall state officials, and at least 30 states that allow the recall of local. Even when it comes to constitutional amendments that originate in the legislature, the people play a role. In every state except for Delaware, constitutional amendments can be proposed by a state legislature, but still have to be voted on by the people to become part of the state's constitution. All of this direct democracy, law that is made, at least in substantial part, by the public, raises long-standing questions. At its best, proponents praise direct democracy as a way for the people to come together on popular issues that legislatures won't act on, often bipartisan. But at its worst, critics have a bunch of worries. They worry about the influence of special interests. They worry about elections that are flooded with big money. They worry about direct democracy being undermined by voters who don't actually fully understand what it is that they're voting on. And then there are the details. How do states actually structure the process of direct democracy? How do they control how it goes from an idea to your ballot? And there's questions about the court's role, right? How do courts decide whether a ballot initiative that's headed for the ballot or that even has been already approved is valid? Here at the State Democracy Research Initiative, we're in the midst of a large project to better understand the law of direct democracy. For today, we have invited 3 of the nation's leading scholars and practitioners on the subject to have a conversation with us about whether and how direct democracy is good for democracy, what people should know about it, and what challenges it faces. So each panelist will take about 5 minutes and give some opening remarks on a direct democracy topic of their choice. We'll start with Chris on people-powered movements, then over to Bruce on California's Proposition 22, and then Vic on recalls. After that, I'll pose a couple of questions for some structured discussion among the panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So without further ado, Chris, over to you.
Thank you. I'll be playing the role of practitioner this evening. Chris Modi feels Figueredo, she, her, ella. As Jeff said, I am the executive director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. We are a movement building infrastructure organization that strengthens our democracy by centering the people most impacted and equity through ballot measures to build state-based, people-centered, powered. Say that 5 times fast. We believe at BIS that ballot measures can be a tool for liberation, and they can be love letters to our people, but how we do it is incredibly important. our partners believe and have seen the power of direct democracy to make some really transformational changes and change the material conditions of people's lives through policy. But we're also working to shift culture and really ask this question of how do we build power through ballot measures. Our theory of change centers around two principles: expanded definition of the win and the 360 ballot measure life cycle. We believe at BIS that success can no longer be defined by simply 50+1% at the ballot. If we're going to be real about building an equitable and just world, then we have to consider who's leading that change and what is the transformational impact it will have on the people who've been pushed to the margins for too long. We believe that it's not just about if we win, it's how we win. That's really important. Successful campaigns are about what they leave behind: struggle organizations, rising leaders, and grassroots power. We believe that if we use every phase of the ballot measure process as a way to bring people together around a common purpose or goal, to build capacity, to shift culture, and to center the people most impacted, then we have something over and above that lasts longer than a policy win or loss. That means that we support the field through the 360 life cycle. So from the idea formation to the planning, to how we set up governance, how we do the policy, how we build our coalitions, gathering signatures, how the campaign is run, civic engagement, voter education, all the way through post-election implementation and beyond. Since 2015, BISC has been working with our state partners to transform the ballot measure ecosystem. We first started by going proactive on issues around democracy and economic justice, and use that as a way to build state infrastructure and state-based power. We won the first wave in 2016, minimum wage that you mentioned before, 1 in 4 states. Then in 2018, a set of democracy and economic justice issues won Amendment 4 in Florida, restoring the voting rights of formerly incarcerated. We got a lot of national attention, and even in the middle of a pandemic in 2020. The example I want to use, I mean, I could talk about Florida, and we can in the question and answer, but actually how it's playing out right now is in Arizona. So we know that in 2020, Arizona became a successful battleground state, and it took a lot of years to shift the power in that state. And ballot measures played a critical role that our partners used to transform that state. It first started in 2015 when our state partners came to us to develop, and we helped resource, exploratory research around minimum wage and earned sick time, and a high earners income tax to benefit K through 12 education. The first eventually became Prop 206, which won in 2016, and the latter eventually became Prop 208, which won at the ballot in 2020. Unfortunately, the state Supreme Court knocked that down, an increasing role that courts are playing in the initiative process. We worked very closely with partners like Lucha, One Arizona, Arizona Education Association, and more to develop campaign governance, guidance on research. We reviewed campaign plans. Many attended our training sessions where we talk about race, power, and privilege and what are the choice points that folks have. And they have engaged in our peer learning cohorts. We worked to help found their ballot measure table, and we've worked with the Arizona Coalition to build a long-term vision about what power looks like in that state and where ballot measures fit in. From the beginning, with our support, these amazing leaders have not only focused on winning policies at the ballot, which they have done, they've used this to strengthen their ability to govern, to run for office, and to lobby state leaders. They were focused on building a foundation that supported future wins, something that left behind, to leave behind. And that strategy's been working. And now what we're seeing more and more are attacks to the ballot measure process. In 2017, we only tracked 33 bills to change the ballot measure process. In 2020, 146 bills and 33 states sought to change the ballot measure process in many states. That's a 300% increase from 2017. And it isn't just happening in the state legislatures. Like I mentioned before, the courts are playing a role too. Just this year, the courts have played a huge role in whether ballot measures make it to the ballot in states like Arizona, where fair elections, the democracy ballot measure got kicked off after getting more than double the amount they were required. Other states like Arizona, Idaho, this is playing out. And now they're referring ballot measures to the ballot, which we're seeing in the fall in states like Arizona and Arkansas, where Arizona faces 3, not 1, not 2, 3 initiative bills that would alter the process. So if we want to talk about direct democracy, to build and transform power, these attacks that we're seeing at the state level to direct democracy is connected to every other attempt that we're seeing right now to limit power that that is led by the people. And it's really important that we move past siloing issues. They're interdependent. They're deeply connected. And if we are going to dismantle what we think is really important at BISC, structural inequities, white supremacy, and achieve a liberation for our people, we have to look at the whole in order to make sure this is a thriving tool.
Thank you so much. Bruce on Zoom, I think we're ready for you if you're ready for us.
I am ready. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes,
so
very good. Okay. So Vic and I come from the hotbed of initiatives, which is California, where everything goes. And I would like to at some point come back on some of the points that were just made by the previous speaker, because I don't think it's a guarantee. I think if you look at California, that there is the kind of idealism that she sees in what public opinion is looking for, that in many cases it's actually opposed to many of the things that she might be in favor of. So I'd like to come back to that, but I'm going to take my my assignment, which is to talk about Prop 22. And there were 2 very controversial topics with California direct democracy. One was the recall, which Vic is going to talk about, and this is Prop 22 is the other one. It's a little bit painful for me to talk about Prop 22 because I'm pretty sure I voted the wrong way. And probably I'm a good illustration of some of the problems of voter ignorance on this one, even though I actually did read all the ballot arguments. I missed the whole provision about 7/8. So I missed the big one in there, which is kind of embarrassing for political scientists. So what was Prop 22? Well, Prop 22 was basically a measure that was going to define people who did these sort of app-based transportation services, Lyft and Uber. It was going to define the drivers as independent contractors, and it was going to adopt labor and wage policy, some of which looked to those of us who read the ballot arguments to be relatively progressive. They were going to apply them to app-based drivers and companies specifically. So they were going to carve out this exemption for these kind of gig workers that would be different from labor laws that apply to full-time workers. Now, the reality is the measure was in reaction to something that had already been passed by the legislature, AB 5 in 2019, which had established a fairly simple 3-factor test of whether somebody was an independent contractor or not, including the gig workers. And the Superior Court of San Francisco basically ruled that, Uber and Lyft were violating AB 5 and they were misclassifying their workers. So Uber and Lyft then, and this is a very common pattern, took to the courts to sort of to contest this decision. But in the end, when it went up to the First District Court of Appeal, it was upheld, and Uber and Lyft were left with a law that they didn't really want to comply with. So they went ahead and did what many people do, and this is something that we've talked about in California for 20, 25 years, is that it's become an arena for people who lose in the legislature to go onto the ballot and put their policies onto the ballot and get people to support them that way when they lose in the legislature. And so they put on Prop 22. Prop 22 is fairly lengthy. And it, on the face of it, when you looked at it, and this is where I got confused a bit, There actually were provisions in there that I was sympathetic to. There were provisions for minimum wage. There were provisions for a safe number of hours worked and healthcare subsidies and training programs and, prohibitions against sexual misconduct. But there was this item which I missed, and I went back and I'm pretty sure it wasn't highlighted in any of the ballot pamphlets, and that was the 7/8 vote that was required by the California State Legislature and the governor's signature before you could actually change Prop 22 in any way. That is, the legislature could change Prop 22 in any way. And that was not unusual because, as Vic will tell you, in California, it is common for statutory amendments to have language in there that puts a delay or puts some limitations on what the legislature can do. So, but nothing has ever been in a 7/8 like was in 22. And so that was very unusual. So needless to say, it's a saga that has all the usual elements about why we have problems with direct democracy in a big state like California with highly professional campaigns. Essentially, these companies, DoorDash and Lyft and Instacart and others, raised enough money to put this on the ballot. We're ultimately able to raise about 250 million approximately to about 31 million on the no side. And they were able to get it passed by approximately a 16-point margin, okay? So again, there's a long literature this. We don't want to say that the money necessarily made a difference. I can say from my own ambivalence and the heated arguments that we were having and the clever way the thing was written to make it seem like it was for workers' rights, that there was a legitimate reason to sort of be confused about what to do on this and whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. In the end, of course, it's now ended up back in court again. It went initially to the state Supreme Court, then it bounced back down. It was pushed down to the Alameda Superior Court. And essentially, two of the provisions I think were declared to be unconstitutional, abridgments of the legislative right to sort of deal with matters related to labor relations, and also that it was a violation of the single subject rule, which is an incredibly ironic finding given how loosely the single subject rule has been defined in California in the past. So I think it's a good example of all the sort of things that we really see as problematic in California. You're going to see that I'm ambivalent, like I think probably a lot of people are. On the one hand, there are good things that happen, but this is an example of where special interest fights are getting out onto the ballot, where if they're done cleverly enough so that they're not too far divergent from the sort of light blue political coloring of the state, they can have a chance of passing. That's not the same thing as tobacco or sort of the utilities that almost just by virtually by just sponsoring something, they're almost destined to lose because their image is so bad. But you have to understand that in California, Lyft and Uber and these other ride apps are extremely popular. And as a matter of fact, Stanford is actually telling people they would much prefer that we take Uber and Lyft as opposed to any of the regular taxi services that we've been using. So this just shows you how embedded it is. So I think there are a lot of lessons in here. Some of them are about money, some of them are about the wording, but these are things that we've known about for quite a while. The one point about this that I think we have to bear in mind is, though, while they have shut off the legislative recourse through the 7/8 provision that takes 7/8 of the legislature to override or amend this 22, the reality is you still can go back through the initiative process. And of course, that's very expensive and it's complicated, but it's not as if there isn't a way to fix this and that we're stuck with it. It can be changed, but it would be at great cost. And it would, of course, be hard to beat the amount of money and the cleverness of the people that have worked on Prop 22 to start with. So I think there are some lessons to be learned. And as I said, there's a long line of cases in California that sort of illustrate many of these same points. So with that, I'll stop and wait for the discussion.
Thank you so much. So two different perspectives on direct democracy so far. And for our third set of remarks, we'll turn to Vic.
First of all, I want to thank Miriam and the other organizers of this worthwhile event for having me. Bruce, it's great to see you. Bruce kind of adverted to the fact that we both come from California. I taught for many years in the University of California system. I miss doing a lot of events in person with you, Bruce. Maybe you can invite me to do something at Stanford in February or March in Champaign. That might be nice. And it's great to be here, in particular, in part, to get to see my old friend, the dean of the Wisconsin Law School, Dan Tokaji. I met Dan first, interestingly enough, when we were both litigating together against a very important California direct democracy initiative, Proposition 209, which in the mid-1990s banned the use of race in school admissions and public employment. And I mention that in part because although Miriam did a good job of kind of laying out a typology of direct democracy, many of the issues that we confront in direct democracy devices kind of they intersect with other aspects of direct democracy. So initiatives, referenda, recall, they're different, but they're all of a similar kind of piece. And my few words on recall, I hope will kind of make that clear. As Miriam mentioned, recall is something that's available to about 20 states at the statewide level and about 30 states at the local level. What is recall? Recall is simply the power of the voters to remove someone from elective or appointed office prior to the end of their term. So if a governor has a 4-year term, you can remove her after 2 years. Or if a legislator has a 4-year term, you can remove him after 3 years by going through a process. Let me compare recall to a few other devices that we're familiar with so we can kind of see where it fits in. It's very similar to impeachment of an executive official, or at the state level, impeachment often works for legislative bodies as well. The federal level, you can't impeach members of the House or the Senate. It can be removed only by expulsion, which requires 2/3 of the House in question. But the difference, of course, between recall and impeachment is it's the voters doing it rather than the elected officials doing it. Second difference is in most places, you don't have to have a reason to recall other than you don't like the person that got elected. As kind of mealy-mouthed or mushy as high crimes and misdemeanors is, it actually has a legal meaning. People might disagree about that, and it may not be judicially enforceable, but there is a meaning to it, and you're not supposed to impeach and convict people unless they're guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, at least at the federal level. Impeachment at the state level often doesn't have a threshold, a substantive threshold, but still it sometimes does, which differentiates it. And then, of course, as Miriam mentioned, recall is very prominent at the local level for county and city officials. But it does occur at the statewide level, as I'll mention in a few moments. Another device you might compare recall to is something we don't talk about today very much. It's called instruction. Instruction is the idea that the people of a state have a right to formally direct in a legally binding way the legislators of the state to do something. So you pass a measure statewide that instructs the Wisconsin legislature to pass the following law. 4 state constitutions at the founding included explicit language conferring a right to instruct or recognizing a right to instruct on behalf of the people. And in all the other states, it was more or less assumed. And I mention this because it's kind of ironic that the biggest case we have today that bears on direct democracy is Moore versus Harper, a Supreme Court case involving the North Carolina partisan redistricting issue. And of course, that involves direct democracy because one of the big responses to partisan gerrymandering has been the independent citizens redistricting commissions that were mentioned earlier that often come into being, as they did in Arizona and other states, by way of direct democracy. But the idea that the legislature of North Carolina is independent of the people is so ahistoric, in part because of devices like instruction. The word legislature at the founding didn't mean some untethered entity. It meant a process of lawmaking, as the Supreme Court has recognized in 4 important cases. And I hope that they'll recognize it in a 5th. I've written more about this than I need to, and more than anyone else in the world, honestly. And my brother and I, law professor at Yale, have a big article in Supreme Court Review this past summer, and we're writing an amicus brief literally now in the case. But it just kind of illustrates that all these things fit together. And then I'll mention one other connection, and that is the difference between state and federal. That we don't have recall or instruction at the federal level. We considered it, the original version of the Bill of Rights included language in what's now the First Amendment that would have conferred or recognized a right of the people of each state to instruct and or recall members of Congress the way states could recall members of the federal Congress under the Articles of Confederation prior to the Constitution. But that provision in the Bill of Rights was rejected on the ground that although people are elected from congressional districts or states, they don't belong to the people of the states. They are federal officials who are elected regionally in the states and then who confer with elected representatives from elsewhere in the country to decide what's best for the country, not just what's in the interests of the people who sent them. So that's kind of why recall was rejected, because it was a different kind of representation at base. And that's why, by the way, I think the Supreme Court was right in the term limits case in the 1990s to say that states cannot impose term limits on members of Congress because those members of Congress might be elected from Wisconsin, but they're not Wisconsin's property. They are supposed to serve the national interest and the national government. And there's yet another example. How do term limits come about? They come about because of direct democracy. You think members of Congress and members of state legislature want to pass limits that place a tight cap on the number of years they can be in office? Of course not. So the term limits initiative is another direct democracy avenue or arena where it plays out. Which brings me back to recall, and I just want to make one big point, and then I'll stop. We had a big in California, even though I'm in Illinois for the last 7.5 years. My family and friends are still, a lot of them in California, so I keep tabs on what's going on there. In California, there was a gubernatorial recall last year of Governor Gavin Newsom. It was the second recall this century. In 2003, the voters of California recalled Gray Davis, the then governor, and replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. This time, Gavin Newsom survived the recall. And there's lots of questions about the recall, both practical and also legal. I just want to mention several of them, and then I'll stop. One, of course, is how many signatures should need to be gathered before a recall is put on the ballot. California has a notoriously low threshold. This is why you had 2 gubernatorial recalls in a century, in 20-some years. Second is, how can the state regulate the signature gathering process? Here there are certain requirements that are placed on signature gatherers. The Supreme Court decided a case out of Colorado a while ago that mucked up this area and said basically when you collect signatures, you're petitioning government, so you can't be limited in your ability to collect signatures. And that's totally wrong. You're not petitioning government. You're trying to qualify something for ballot access. Supreme Court. So much of law is deciding what the right frame is, what the right set of cases to apply is, and the Supreme Court just botched it, which messed up a lot of recall law in places like California. Third, do you want to have 1 or 2 separate events for recall? In California, they hold 2 elections on a single day. The first part is up or down on the incumbent. If the incumbent gets 50%, she survives. If she doesn't, if she loses more votes than she gains, then part 2 is an instant who gets to replace her. And so maybe you want to separate those by a few weeks. California does not do that. Relatedly, in California, it's very easy to make the second part of the ballot. It doesn't hardly take anything. So you can have hundreds of people on that second part of the replacement ballot, which leads to the final point I want to make. This past time in California, this past year, a couple of my colleagues raised an argument that had surface plausibility, but was legally kind of bankrupt. From their former colleagues of Bruce from UC Berkeley's law school and former colleagues of mine from the law school system at the UC. Don't need to name them, but they argued the following, that because Gavin Newsom, if he were to be recalled, would still arguably be more popular than any person who replaced him on the second part of the ballot. So let's say he loses on the recall part 51-49. So 49% of the people wanted to keep him. The winner on the second part of the ballot, in part because there's so many candidates, could have as few as 30 or 40% of the voters, or 20% of the voters behind them. And it violates kind of one person, one vote, voter equality principles for someone who was supported by 49% of the electorate to lose out to someone who had much less. The reason why this this idea that has surface plausibility goes nowhere is because it's not a single all-in compare A to B election. It's two separate elections. It's a removal of the candidate at the first level and then a disqualification of that person from running at the second level. So the real question, which they didn't understand because they misframed it, is whether it's permissible to deny someone who just lost a recall election from being considered in the second election that happens to take place the same day. And if you can block someone from running for a third term by term limits, and if you can block someone who's been impeached from holding office again, you can block someone who's been removed by recall from running for re-election or to fill her own vacancy right away. I think that's kind of just constitutional common sense. I'd take it a step farther and pose a question, and we can talk about it later if people are interested. But it's not even clear to me that, again, by direct democracy, because that's likely how it would have to come about, that you could not insist on a higher threshold for incumbents to win than non-incumbents. You couldn't entrench incumbency, but you could say, okay, we could term you out altogether. We could limit you to 1 or 2 terms. Instead, we'll let you run for re-election, but you got to beat your opponent by 10 points or more. Otherwise, there's a lot of kind of built-in advantages of incumbency, and so that's why we have term limits is to kind of counteract some of those advantages. So if you can do it kind of wholeheartedly, why can't you do it in part by creating a different passing threshold? So I think my colleagues at the UC were wrong on so many levels, but I'll stop there and turn it back over to Miriam.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to all three of you for those really interesting remarks. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions before we take audience questions, but just for a reminder for those who are participating virtually to go ahead and send those through the Q&A function. So I'm hoping that this discussion will continue to kind of zero in on the big question, which is whether ultimately direct democracy or corrosive to it, or maybe a better way to think of that is when is direct democracy good for democracy and when is it not? And I think maybe one starting point is something that Bruce mentioned, which is the question of voter information, right? The possibility that even Bruce thinks he may have voted the wrong way because he missed some implication that was buried on, page 10 or whatever. So there's this persistent fear that voters won't fully understand what they're voting on. And what I'm hoping to do is get your views on how big of a fear, how big of a concern that really is, and then what tools there are to combat it. And just to give a kind of local example of that, here in Wisconsin, there's a case pending before the state Supreme Court about our Victims' Rights Amendment, our Marsy's Law Amendment. And the plaintiffs argued, and a lower court judge accepted the argument that the ballot language wasn't clear enough because it didn't fully make clear to voters that when they expanded the rights of victims of crimes, they also would be in some circumstances limiting the rights of criminal defendants. And so that's one possible example. There's other examples that you all are probably familiar with around the country where the language is actually so convoluted that it's not clear what you get if you vote yes or no. Like what did I actually just do? And of course, every state has a sort of different way of getting voters informed. There's voter guides, there's versions that have an argument from both sides, there's others that just have a concise statement, there's some that get vetted by a Secretary of State or an Attorney General or a court. So the question, for each of you, just briefly, is do you think this is a real worry that undermines the value of direct democracy? And if so, what do you think is the best way to address it? Want to start?
Sure. So I certainly agree that voters can be misled, they can have buyer's remorse, and especially as Bruce pointed out, when an initiative measure in particular has a kind of poison pill that makes it hard for anybody to change it without running a gauntlet of putting something else on the ballot. It's complicated. On the other hand, I well understand why initiatives can't be written so as to answer each and every question, because as Chief Justice Marshall said in McCulloch versus Maryland, you cannot have public documents that are written with the prolixity of a code. They would be scarcely understood by the public. So, I don't think that the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and various state conventions by popular or essentially popular democracy is particularly problematic, even though the words of the Constitution are pretty grand, and you don't always know exactly what you're getting. You're getting a set of principles, and you can read newspaper editorials in the Federalist Papers and the like. So I think it's not the easiest balance to draw. On the bigger question of is direct democracy good or what, I think it's most justifiable in situations where we can expect the legislature to have a structural conflict of interest that would prevent it from acting. So things like pay or term limits or the like, those are natural arenas for me. And then relatedly, in California, and Bruce, I'd love to hear his views about this, in many instances, things that got put on the ballot in California did so after the legislature really couldn't make headway on a problem that everyone recognized as a problem. And so, one answer to having less direct democracy or less harmful direct democracy is for legislatures to do a better job themselves. And I'm not sure how you go about doing that, but the two are obviously connected.
Chris or Bruce, want to weigh in?
Well, I'm certainly willing to weigh in. Although, first of all, Miriam, I do want to object to the use of the word ignorant and say that I just
drawing that from the literature.
I would call it, Miriam,
Nothing personal.
I would call it oversight or something, But at any rate, okay. So I actually agree with Vic that the strongest case for direct democracy is in the conflict of interest and political reform realm. I do think that in many instances we were able to do things, as he pointed out, like the independent redistricting commissions, and that we would not have been able to do if we had just left it to the legislature. However, I would add to the list things having to do with items that go into the budget, because even if you believe that citizens should speak up on whether they want more education funding or they want better parks or whatever, I don't think earmarking items into the budget without some notion of where you're going to pay for it or what you're going to displace is the way to make good budgeting. And a lot of our problems get papered over in California. We have a structural deficit, but we keep doing so well in our high tech with our high-tech industry that we keep reaping lots of surplus and then papering over the structural surplus problem or the structural deficit problem that we have. So I do think that on budgeting matters, there are a lot of states that don't allow certain topics to be dealt with by direct democracy. And now you could go the participatory democracy route. That is, you could use advisory ballots to get people to speak up, or you could you could have an indirect initiative for certain things that are very technical where it would go to the legislature. But I think I speak for a lot of political scientists who believe that there's a difference between supplementing representative democracy and supplanting it completely. And that distinction was there early on in the distinction between populists and progressives and how they thought about direct democracy mechanisms. And a lot of us, Liz Gerber, myself, and other people that were working on this intensely about 20 years ago really felt like on many very important topics like the budget, it really ought to be something that supplements representative democracy, presents a check or forces people to reconsider things, but it shouldn't be a matter where you allow what happens right now. That is, you get measures that add to expenditures without coming up with a tax that are favored by groups that can't get it through the legislature. So I do think that while I agree with that Vic's notion that it's good for reform, I would say there are some areas where other states, in California, everything can go on the ballot pretty much. We've taken most of the controls off, and I don't think that's a smart idea. I think that's asking for trouble. And not that the legislature can't create its own trouble, but it's multiplying the trouble of the legislature with the trouble of the people.
Indeed, can I just build on that for 1 second? So in California, there's a distinction between state constitutional amendments, which just require signatures gathering and a simple majority to pass, versus state constitutional revisions, which have to come from the legislature itself. And a revision is something that affects the structure of government. And to me, that's always been exactly backwards. If you want to reform the way government works, you shouldn't have to go through the elected standing legislature to get it to qualify on the ballot. So I think the distinction that Bruce draws between kind of political reform and certain kinds of policy measures that ought to be left to elected representatives, California not only doesn't get it right, it gets it 180 degrees wrong by this revision amendment distinction.
Well, you should be happy then, because the court really has been very lax on that distinction. And how do I know that? I know that because I was pushing very hard that something as fundamental as term limits really should have been treated by the constitutional revision process. Okay, so there is a process that involves. Yeah, okay, but just let me finish my sentence. Okay, all I'm saying is that we had a process that would have involved going back to the voters again. We have a constitutional revision process. I just think that it was that particular measure was, we had to go back and change it because it really had terrible consequences for lawmaking as it was originally, as the term limits was originally devised. Sorry, go ahead.
So although someone called me an idealist, I don't think direct democracy should not have any guardrails around it, right? Yep. And I think, one of the things that we've learned from our research, especially of communities of color, if voters don't understand something generally, typically, they do understand the impact, and voters of color especially will vote no if they don't understand something because they don't want to make a wrong guess of something that might happen to their community. And simply putting an issue on a ballot does not guarantee a win or a loss. Voter education is incredibly important to ensure that voters understand it. The first thing I noticed when I saw Prop 22 was the 7/8 piece. And I was telling the folks in California, it's like, you got to lead with that. Like, that is a huge overreach. I think Californians especially would understand that. And I'm also not surprised that folks from California are a little more skeptical. I think the real question that exists right now is, does our democracy actually represent the people? Is representative democracy actually working? Are we seeing our state legislatures, our federal government actually represent the cares and concern of the people? And I think that's why you have seen, especially in the last 10 years, with the gerrymandering that's happened, with the way a lot of with the state legislature control, you're seeing in states where it is possible more citizen-led initiatives to address really key issues that are impacting people's lives, like raising the minimum wage, like formerly incarcerated, like increasing revenue for public education. And there's always a downfall to anything, right? I mean, taxpayer Bill of Rights that happened in Colorado over 20 years ago has crippled the state's ability to raise revenue and pay for public services. At the beginning, for marriage equality, there were a lot of initiatives that lost. And after a lot of organizing and talking to communities and trying to shift the narrative, you started to see, obviously we saw the shifts in marriage equality won in many states. So I think the key question here is, like, what is the voter education piece? Who are the groups on the ground that are going out into communities and explaining, and are we giving the time and the ability to do that, to ensure that voters understand what's before them?
Okay, so it's just about 4:50. We have 11 minutes left, actually. And against all odds, I'm going to remember to say the CLE password. So if you are attending virtually and you want CLE credit, today's passcode is Ballot. BALLOT, and case does not matter. We now have time for a few more questions. And in the interest of time, I'm sort of gathering questions from the audience and one from my state and local government law class. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to direct one to each of our panelists. So Chris, let me pick up with you, because one thing that it seems like people are interested in is whether there is a state that's doing this well. It seems like we've heard a lot about California potentially not being that state. So is there a state that we would look to as sort of a model of how to ensure that direct democracy is for the people and is not, sort of saddled with some of the problems that we've described today?
A couple of states. I've been really a state that doesn't get a lot of attention nationally, Missouri. There is a lot of threshold requirements, signature gathering requirements. There's a role in state government, and there's a huge organizing table or in that state that is using that as a crux to use direct democracy to improve certain statutes in the states, as well as shift power in the states. Arizona had been an example, unfortunately, because the governor has stacked the state Supreme Court. We are now seeing the impacts of the courts and the ability to have this push pull between courts, state legislature, and people. In Michigan, unfortunately, the Board of Canvassers originally knocked off the abortion ballot measure. Thankfully, the state courts came in and had and actually allowed that to appear before voters. So, those are a couple of states that I've seen, not just think of the direct democracy itself, but how it connects to the other levers of government and power and how they work together are a couple of examples.
Thank you. Okay, so Vic, my next question is for you. And Chris's mention of a state Supreme Court is sort of my segue here. And this question comes in partnership with my state and local government law class, where we've been reading state case law about ambiguous initiatives and what state courts do with that ambiguity.
Okay.
So my question is, what tools or methodologies should courts use to interpret a ballot initiative whose scope or extent or meaning is not entirely clear? Chris mentioned before Florida's Amendment 4, the Florida Supreme Court decision interpreting the legislation that implemented / undermined Amendment 4 said that they were only going to use textualism, and they were going to step aside from earlier precedent that said they might look outside the language of the enacted constitutional amendment to look at, other sorts of materials. Other states, they say they're looking for the intent of the voters. Query how exactly they figure out what that intent is. They might look at a voter guide. They might look at what was on the ballot. States seem generally hesitant to look at actual media coverage, although that might be what people themselves are absorbing. So, what is the right way to figure out what a ballot initiative means once it's been adopted?
So I'd say, I think three things. First, the question that you pose is really not necessarily limited to ballot measures and direct democracy. We could ask the same set of questions about a statute that a legislature passes or a constitutional provision in the state or federal context.
Right, with the complication that the voters had to vote on this. So you've got not just the proponents who drafted it or the legislature who referred it, but then the voters and whatever their intent was.
Right, but in the legislature, we have the committee that kind of vetted it, and then we have the whole legislature that adopted it, and you've got media. So in general, I'm not sure that we should look at that many different kinds of sources. It seems to me perfectly appropriate to look at what the voters might have thought the words meant, and one tool for that is what people were saying about it, what newspapers were saying about it, what radios and online social media and the like were saying. It can't be, there's no silver bullet saying, well, this is the right source. But that brings me to the second big point, and that is it doesn't have to be the same for every state. I mean, you have written a lot about, the importance of state courts interpreting state constitutions. And one of the many things that galls me about this ISL case, the Amar versus Harper, is the notion that, the North Carolina Supreme Court has made a mistake or made up law because they're not hewing to some particular form of textualism. The U.S. Supreme Court is not always textualist, interpreting the Constitution or statutes. And certainly states can have different traditions of interpretation. I think it'd be nice if over time the voters could be informed about how the courts are interpreting things so that they can take that into account as a backdrop when they decide whether to enact something or not. But federalism allows each state to craft its own solution, both as to the procedures for direct democracy, but also the way the courts might implement direct democracy. So in answer to your question, I'd have to know a lot more about the history and tradition of the state, the courts, et cetera, because I don't think there's one size that fits all. That's not my vision of federalism and the 10th Amendment and the Republican Guarantee Clause.
Okay, wonderful. So with our last question for you, Bruce, I'm wondering what you think about the guardrails that should be required to get something on the ballot. So one person has written in that in California there are with many A's, too many ballot initiatives on the ballot. And more generally, someone in the audience asks, essentially, how do you strike this balance? If the bar is too low, you get a ballot that's cluttered with everybody's pet projects. If the ballot is too high, then it ceases to be a meaningful alternative tool, except for anyone with tons of money. So, how do you think about that balance?
Precisely the way you just said it. You're between a rock and a hard place, Miriam. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. On the one hand, as we tried to tinker with our requirements for, signatures, et cetera, we've discovered that it's just fed into an industry of professional signature gatherers, professional people that write these things. And then, of course, if you're in a state that has a ton of 30-year-old billionaires as a result of high tech, you get some of the wackiest ideas of how you're going to change the state. So maybe in California, we should definitely care about, the expense part. But and then, as you say, if it's too low, then you get what Vic was talking about with the recall, where I had a couple of former students, and then there was a prostitute, and there were dancers and various other people that were on the ballot to replace Gray Davis. So, you tell me which hell you want to live in. I don't know. Would I rather have a billionaire hell, or do I want to have the loony hell of the recall? I don't know. I'd rather be somewhere in the middle.
Wow. It's hard to follow that, but I will say that I want to make the most of our remaining 3 minutes. So maybe we can close with a little bit of a lightning round. And I guess the question would just be, we've heard about a lot of problems. We've heard about a lot of promise. And the question would be, if you had a magic wand and you could either make one adjustment to direct democracy or promote one feature of it that you wish people knew more about or appreciated more, what would that be? When we, in this unlikely event that we're given a direct democracy magic wand?
I don't know that I have a specific proposal or tactic or device, but I'd build on something that both of my esteemed colleagues have mentioned, and that is fitting direct democracy more coherently into the larger frame of government interacting with elected representatives. So whether that's giving the legislature a chance to react to what is adopted and a period of time to adopt something that could substitute for it. And I know that would be a hard kind of idea to implement. Or I think advisory measures that Bruce adverted to are good. I'm shocked that the members of the California Supreme Court, some of my friends, seem kind of reluctant to allow the voters to weigh in by formally giving their views on what policy should be. So that dynamic needs to be improved, as well as some technical fixes in signature gathering and signature thresholds, et cetera.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Vic. Is like, for me, I'm not a person who believes like direct democracy is the way and it's the only way. I am more interested in the different tools before us and how to govern and how they work together, and engaging more people in the process. Yes, we can vote, but that's a pretty passive view of democracy. I think that we, the people, should have more ability to make decisions on things that govern our lives. And so then, to me, how do we create this as not an adversarial tool, but actually a partnership between state legislatures and government and the people to create a more thriving democracy? For me, like, that's the question that always comes to mind. Not like a magic wand, but how are we using any tool before us to have more effective governing power that actually includes the people?
Great. And Bruce, final word?
Final word is, I won't repeat what the other two said because I agree 100% that, and that's why I mentioned the indirect initiative. I would say, though, to finish, just to irk, the whole question, we'll get back to the recall, which is still a very sore subject with those of us in California because of how close we came to Armageddon We do it happens once a decade, so it's not like we'd never been there before. But I really think a small little change would be to separate out those two elections that that Vic was talking about, because it presents a strategic disadvantage here, because and it creates a lot of manipulation, because what happens is the party of the governor has to suppress anybody that might challenge them within the party. And so you get the situation where a minority party that doesn't really have any right to claim to be governor wins because of the division within the majority party. So that's fixed. That's fixable by just separating out the two elections by different rules in different months, et cetera. So that's one thing I would change.
Thank you so much. Okay, one more time. The code today is Ballot, BALLOT. I want to thank all of you for joining us in person and online, and I want to thank our terrific panelists today, so please join me in thanking them.